Good morning, everyone.
Okay.
We're welcome to today's Let's Talk Dairy webinar. So today we're going to focus on the winter milk production side of the country, and we're joined by Aidan Lawless, who's the farm manager for us in Johnstown Castle in County Wexford. And we're going to be joined from the dark by Joe Patton's voice. So Joe is going to talk about the winter diet, and Aidan is going to give us a rundown on how the farm is performing at the moment in Johnstown Castle at the minute. So Joe, you're going to kick off there, and we're going to bring Aidan in then shortly to give the update on the farm.
Okay, that's grand. So good morning. We'll base really what we're going to talk about this morning on a lot of the stuff we would be doing over the years in the herd in Johnstown Castle in County Wexford. So to move on. So look, that's really what we're going to look at just quickly, maybe just to set the scene, Stuart, as to what's going on in Johnstown in terms of where the herd is at, what type of stock we're dealing with. Then it will bring in on the current situation on the farm, because it's an interesting time of the year for winter milk production, because we're in that gap I suppose at the moment between the last of the grazing and starting into the winter diet proper. So there's a few decisions around that, particularly on closing covers and getting the winter diet started. We might just highlight for a couple of minutes to what way we ran the dry cows for the last couple of years and maybe get Aidan's thoughts on that. And we'll finish out then with sort of the guidelines with how we are putting the winter diets together. This is for the milking, for the fresh milking cows basically, and what we're looking for there. Okay, so not to dwell on it for too long, just to give people an idea where we're at. There's a lot going on in Johnstown, and maybe the winter herd is just a part of it. But as I say, when we go further into the diets, we'll concentrate specifically on the winter diet part. So look at basically what we're working with there in terms of the dairy unit. It's 55 hectares. Part of that is, there's an outblock as well of maybe close to 20 hectares, running about 150 cows. And they're split at the moment between 60% autumn, 40% spring, but with different trials and all the rest of it. We generally, what we have at the moment is block autumn systems and block spring systems running within the dairy unit, but we'll show the figures for EBI and all are common across them all. So that's really what we're working with. We will be talking maybe our autumn cows are run as block autumn systems at this stage. The herd EBI is 175, which gets it up into the higher levels for the country. Growing somewhere year to year, sort of 14.5, 15 tons grass growth on mixed soil types. Now I know when we have people down from Calving or Monaghan or Leitrim, they laugh at us when we say mixed soil types, but believe it or not, there is a little bit of wetland in Johnstown as well. So look, you can see on the right hand there, we're not going to go into that in too much detail. We have our winter milk systems. There's also some work going on with spring calving cows and multi-species swords as well, which is happening on some part of the farm. And obviously, given the expertise in environmental research, there's a huge amount of work going on things like nitrogen efficiency, water quality within the campus itself. So look, that's what's there in the background. So we really want to just see, maybe, as we go further on, we'll see we're really specifically talking about the winter portion of things there, right? So look at just where we're at the moment, just to see, this is across the whole herd now. So that's just our co-op report to the end of the end of August. So they've 401 kilos of solids done for the year to date, averaging just short of 20.5 kilo or litres of milk to date. 438 and 369 protein is where the solids are at. So look at, based on that, and given the fact that there's going to be close to 2/3 of the herds freshening down and going into peak production again, we're probably looking about, for the whole herd, that's including the multi-species cows, the winter herd, the whole lot, they'll average around 570 kilos of milk solids on just around a ton of concentrate. That's what the herd is doing. But within that, then in our winter system, our winter herd last year, so let's say from September 19 to September 20, they did about 620 kilos of milk solids off 1.6 ton of concentrate. 7,500 kilos of milk is roughly where we're at. So look at, that's the kind of cows we're really talking about. Kind of that 600 kilos of milk solids is really where we're looking off about 1.6 ton of concentrate, right? So there's your calving pattern, Stuart. Just to put it in context, and we get on to talking about feeding, we're looking for a very tight block in the autumn. sort of starting in mid-September, finished up, pretty much finished up by middle of November, I suppose. No carryover cows to speak of between the groups, and again in the spring then a very tight calving pattern in the spring. So maybe this is relevant when we start talking about the feeding side of things, because really, when Aidan's putting together the management for the herd in the winter period, we really are talking about managing a block of freshly calved cows in the December, January period for feeding. We don't have too many stragglers or too many sort of carryover cows or lower yielding stale cows to be dealt with. It really is a case of producing our winter milk with fresh calvers, because we don't have the late calvers, the April, May, June calvers to be filling the litres there. It is a freshly calved bunch, if you like. So that's important to remember too when it comes to deciding our diets. Again, there's our EBI, so 175, as we said, 100 kilos of milk or thereabouts in the proof, so not massively milky. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, not excessive. I was just saying.
Not excessively milky, no. But look at that, and the interesting thing about that, at that level of milk production, if we put these cows on sort of 600 kilos of concentrate on a spring system, they're going to do us 490, 500 kilos of milk solids. If we put them into the winter system on 1.5 ton of concentrate, calving in September, they'll do 620 kilos of milk solids. So there's quite a response there to the production system in terms of milk production, but overall the fertility in spring or autumn would be relatively good at this stage. Now, it took time to get that right, but I think, and Aidan can come in on that in a few minutes, I think the fertility is starting to really come true after, probably, there was a good 7 to 10 years there of trying to work at it, but it's coming where we'd like it to be. And look, you can see on the young stock, the profile is all about getting EBI pushing forward. So that's the type of stock we're dealing with. And, our PDs for fat and protein are high as well. So I think the reason I'm mentioning that is that when we start talking about diets, I think a lot of the time some of the lads in winter production are asking, what can we feed to get higher solids in the winter time? Well, breeding is going to dictate an awful lot of what your milk solids percentages are in the winter period too. So just to keep that in mind, okay?
You have a very strong emphasis on fertility there, Joe, as well, actually. Probably better fertility sub-indexes than a lot of the spring herds that we'd see.
Yeah, I suppose so. But look, we would make the point that really, I suppose, in terms of a winter versus spring, we probably have very, very similar profile for EBI, Stuart, with probably maybe 50 kilos more milk in the proof than a lot of spring herds would be. That's it. So the idea that it has to be radically different, we'd question that. Now, as I say, when we did a trial a couple of years ago there with spring versus split calving versus autumn calving, there was something like 90 kilos to 100 kilos of milk solids difference between the spring and autumn system. So that makes you wonder, is the production differences in the production differences are there. The cow is actually quite a robust cow. She can work in either system, which is important, and it's not like we have one breeding policy for the autumn herd and one breeding policy for the spring herd. We're happy that they're doing what they're supposed to do. So we'll get on to the feed now in a second, but just to give you an idea of what we're dealing with really, because it is important to put it in some context. This is as close to maybe as what our average lady would be in the herd. So about close to the average 190 for EBI, maintenance milk subindex of 70, 90 for fertility, and our maintenance subindex of 11. So you're talking sort of 620, 630 kilo cow thereabouts. You can see as a heifer, she'll do about 420 kilos of milk solids, and in her that's fifth calver now, she's doing, as a mature cow, she'll be doing 650 to 700 kilos of milk solids, right? That's what our mature cows would be, bringing us back to 600 kilos in the whole herd when you bring the heifers into it. So that's what you're talking about. You can see mature yields in and around that sort of 7.5 to 8,000, 490 fat, 370 protein. That's the kind of cow we're probably looking at having. That we need. That's the challenge, is to feed that cow over the winter period, right? So that's where she is. An average of 7.5. You look at this old doll again. Nothing much to look at. 230 of EBI. Her production for the year, she's closer to 9,500 kilos at 367, 407. So there is that range within the herd as well that we have to account for a little bit too. So we're happy enough that those are the type of cows we're dealing with. They're not massively high yield and not peak, but they do tend to have a very persistent lactation, which gives us good production for the year as a whole. So we'd expect the cows to be milking sort of 32 kilos inside and still doing 25, 26 kilos in May or June, having calved in the autumn. That's where a lot of the additional milk comes from, is actually their performance on grass in the spring.
Mm-hmm.
So look, that's the type of herd you're dealing with, and then it's up to us then really to put the diets together to sort them out. So look at maybe I'll just bring Aidan in there now, just to see where we're at with this idea, Aidan, of the current situation of running out of grass, I suppose, and maybe making the transition from grazing into the winter diet. And this the wedge up here, Aidan, is for the higher, it's obviously for the autumn calvers at a reasonably high stocking rate. So maybe just explain what we're looking at here.
Yeah, so I suppose the high stocking rate, they're stocked at nearly 4 cows per hectare. So, but for me at this time of the year with the autumn calf cows, too much grass is a bigger headache than running out of grass. If we do have to house a week earlier, and it's not a problem because we're not trying to milk cows off grass. We'll be milking right throughout the winter anyway, so it's not really an issue if we house a week earlier. Far more beneficial if we can get out a week earlier in the spring. There's just the value of the grass. The cows respond better to it. If you offer the cows silage or grass at this time of the year, they'll eat the silage and leave the grass. Whereas in spring they'll eat the grass and leave the silage. So at the moment we're on the high stocking rate system. We're up on about 75, 78%, nearly 80% of them calved. And if you ask me in a week's time, it'll probably be the same. We're just at that sort of lag period between maybe replacement AI straws and then the sweeper bulls coming in. So we'll be quiet for the next week or so, and then hopefully we'll have a bit of a bang again to finish up, like I said, towards the mid to late November. So we have a reasonable demand where there's no forage except grass going in at the moment, except for the last night before last. We brought them in around 9 o'clock at night, just on off grazing, and we offered them about a kilo or two of silage, it's probably more to keep me happy than the cows happy. But we want to try when we start putting in a second forage into it. It's very hard to get through grass and get it cleaned out. So ideally, for that system, we want to have a sort of 75% of our ground, I suppose, at least grazed off by the end of October, and then just clean off the last 25% maybe by day and house by night, and then be in full time, settled on our winter diet sort of mid-November, at least maybe 3 to 4 weeks before we start breeding in sort of towards the 15th or 20th of December.
So Aidan, you were saying yesterday as well, I think it's interesting, and you mentioned it there as well, about the lag just between the AI and the sweeper bulls, but you also looked at the dates, the calving dates last year. I think it's no harm to mention it, because I suppose for the spring herds, maybe that are, even for the winter herds or the split herds that are going drying off spring calving cows now in the next couple of weeks as well, they do need to factor in what you're going to mention here now, and when to dry off the cows, aren't they?
Yeah, that's right. Especially, I suppose, if you're using a long-acting tuberette, and just be aware of that and all as well. Farmers are aware of it, but I suppose it just really smacked me in the face a little bit, because even our own discussion group, some of them were saying, you want to be giving them 10 days or anything. But I look back on all our calvings last year, and all the cows that were in calf to Frisian, whether they had a Frisian bull or a Frisian heifer, on average, they calved at 274 days. So from service. So that's on average. Ones carrying, maybe very few of them carried over 280, and some of them were back down to 270 maybe or so, but a lot of them calving at that. Like the days of sort of working off a gestation 283 for, even like you're saying, for dry off or anything like that. We've sort of changed it around. We were more going at 275 now this year, and sort of there's a good few of them going over then, and a few of them going under, but we seem to be more accurate at that. Like, so yeah.
No, that was
so Aidan, just to clear that, now you're on. This is for your autumn. This is for all the cows on this system are basically calved since early September, or calving since early September. The current feeding is
September, Joe, like
just
one would. Well, like our target calving date was, I think, about the 20th, but like that's where, so that's on a 280 day sort of lactation. So we've that 80% or 75% of calves since, really, I think the first bang of them came around the 12th to 14th of September. And so what we're coming into that 5 or 6 week period. We're not going to meet the 90% calved within 6 weeks, but probably within 7 or 7.5 weeks we probably will. So just that. Yeah.
But they haven't been fed any silage as such yet. The fresh calvers.
No. They're on grass,
yeah.
and at the moment they're getting. Well, we just upped it when the weather broke a little bit there in the last 2 days. I've upped to that. If they were calved over 2 weeks, they were on 4 kilos of a high UFL nut, 0.95 UFL nut. And up until now, that was a 14% nut. It probably should have been a 16, but we were just finishing out the bin. So we're actually just have to get the delivery there today now. So we're going on to the 18% nut now, because within the next week or so we'll be in by anyway. So.
And you're happy with the body condition? Because it is a question that comes up a bit, like about, is the autumn grass is just, as fellas might say, it's just a drink more than a feed.
Yeah.
They're not melting in terms of body condition. I think the EBI probably helps with that as well, though. But what would you think of their condition? Are you happy enough with them?
No, we're happy. We're happy with the condition at the moment. But I noticed even last year, where that 2 week period, once you go beyond the 15th of November, like our stock and rate system, we have more grass and we just have to stay out grazing. We'll do well to get sort of 60-65% grazed on that by the end of October, and we have another 30-35% to graze, because we just don't have the same demand, and we have more grass to graze. So on that system, I thought we lost a little bit of condition, maybe more so just in that sort of 15 to sort of the mid to late November, when we were still grazing, even though only and they were well fed, but just like I said, the cows prefer.
So that's it. Sure, that's what Aidan has been doing in the last few years, is not allowing the cover build too heavy on that system in the autumn, and be able to, because they're all calved in the autumn, be able to get spin out the last round to be sort of in by early November, and then feed them well for the winter period and be ready to go in the spring. So really, in a way, like the key,
go on, Joe. Yeah, all right.
Yeah, so the key almost to making sure your body condition on your cows is good in the autumn is making sure that you manage your covers correctly in August, that you don't get the farm bill too heavy. Do you know what I mean? So it's all linked together in a way. Sorry,
and then transitioning as well to actually have them in and settled on the diet before you do start breeding is important too.
And once they're in, feed them damn well. Sorry, Aidan. Sorry.
No, ideally our sort of peak cover, so we don't want to be grazing anything much over 1800 at any. Now sometimes it will happen, but generally, and probably you would have said, Joe, as well, it's sort of nearly it's the cost of the autumn system is that we're not getting as good value as we should really out of our August, September grass. That sort of we end up cutting silage sort of generally towards the end of August or even the first week of September to correct the wedge and bring down that sort of we're taking out lovely grass, if you like, really, and baling it. But rather than that, just if we ended up grazing that, we wouldn't get through because our demand is only really kicking in from late September on. We just wouldn't get through our grazing ground in October that we want to. So yeah.
What's the objective in terms of closing cover then, Aidan? Is it the same?
Main objective, I would have said to Joe yesterday, once the 1st of October comes, we don't graze that ground again. So the closing cover sort of will look after itself then. So generally what will happen, it's probably generally around maybe 600 or so, but it's what'll generally happen is we're grazing lower covers in the last round. So the recovery tends to be a lot better, and we've no white butter, and so we've a green cover. So anything that's even grazed in the last 5 or 6 days or 10 days is jumping out of the ground again, because it was really only a cover of sort of 1800 that was grazed. And we have a shorter period, so we have very little. Even our last 30% is still grazed in the last 10 days or the first 10 days of November. So we have a tighter, shorter wedge, and we have a bigger block of. We wouldn't have the sort of a higher block of grass then coming into the spring, ideally, hopefully, anyway. So that's just we generally grow a good bit of grass from when we close from the first. So anything that's grazed from the 1st of October on isn't grazed again. And the odd occasion, if the weather breaks, we could have a paddock that might have a heavy enough cover on it that was grazed towards the late September, and
actually leave it there.
If it's too messy, we'll get a lot better value out of that by grade. We could go out and sweep that out at any time in January if the weather was good and the cows would love it, rather than fighting with it in the autumn.
Okay.
We move on, Stuart.
Do,
Are
Joe,
we
yeah.
happy enough? It's
Yeah.
it's really peak cover in the autumn is the key message there. Don't let the
And I
farmers
suppose
go out of
just,
hand.
yeah, and just to emphasize again, so you're hoping to close around the 600 mark, so Aidan, and your opening cover then is kind of, you're still aiming to get up around that maybe 900 of an opening cover, back
Yeah,
to spring principles again then.
Like our biggest priority is sort of we close from the 1st of October, and if some years you'll get better growth than others, but like even if it's if we're ahead of ourselves, we're not worried, because we won't have a problem with sort of too heavy covers in the spring. That won't never be a problem with us,
Because you've significant demand straight away, like.
And they're mid-lactation cows too.
Yeah.
Their intakes are up at 20 kilos, so they're not like a freshly calved cow going to grass. They'll actually mow out whatever's in front of them. They'll take it with them in the spring. Look at, we'll just move on maybe on.
Just before
sorry,
you do
Stuart,
go on, Joe, there's a question for Aidan there. What's the average yield and milk composition at the moment, Aidan?
At the moment, they're really just jumping up and down. But on that autumn herd at the moment, they're about 25 litres and at 455 butter fat, and I think it's about 390 protein. That's from the autumn herd, but they're all over the place a little bit because there's fresh calvers coming in to keep them, and you know, they're all fresh calvers really, but like there's only a week or two there, and some of them, they're at the most of them are only 5 weeks calved at max. Like, so
okay,
yeah.
So they're not at peak yet, like, so
not at peak, and you just want to keep them healthy at this stage, Stuart, as well. Like, I mean, there would be no issues really there, Aidan, with displacements or issues like that. We'll come to it now in a second on the dry cow thing, but I suppose, look, we want to just get them settled in, and then when they get in on the diet, you're looking at probably feeding them for sort of 31, 32 kilos when they settle in. So we'll come to that in a second. Okay, so look, I suppose, look at management plan. I suppose 55, 60 days dry, I suppose, thereabouts. We want them calving at body condition score of 3, which is a bit of a challenge on the autumn calvers, given that the late lactation diet for an autumn calver essentially is June, July grass or August grass. So it is a challenge maybe to keep the condition tight on cows, actually, compared to maybe a lot of cases in spring herds, maybe where you're facing into low DMD silage for the winter and maybe cows maybe thin at drying off. Generally speaking, it's to hold the condition is what we're trying to do. So Aidan would graze the dry cows would graze after the milking cows. I should say, maybe for this, you know, really nailing down the post grazing residuals in that sort of August September period. They're until about 3 weeks pre-calving. We're not that worried about gut fill at all in our dry cows at that stage of the year. At that stage, they're eating probably 7-8 kilos dry matter maybe of residual grass essentially. And then from sort of 2 to 3 weeks pre-calv, and then we would move them then sort of 3 weeks to be safe onto our transition diet, which is not too fancy or not too high tech, but it does work. Like, it's basically 4 or 5 kilos of a standing hay, basically, or 4 or 5 kilos of a strip grazed low fertilizer grass. So they didn't get much fertilizer for a couple of rounds prior to going in on this. So it's built up as a heavy cover. We'll see it in a second. They get haylage to appetite in a round feeder. Essentially, they're fed outside. Then they get a kilo of barley or thereabouts with their standard mineral supplement in it, high mag mineral supplement. They would have been getting buckets in the field up to that point for trace minerals. And then we do have the option, which we've used some years, with just putting extra mag chloride through the water if needed, just to push them on, depending on the year. So look, at the majority of them calve for that system, they calve outdoors unassisted, and it's just a case of strip. You can see that's our sort of calving paddock there. You can see what type of residuals are left behind. They're only in there for, as I said, for a couple of weeks pre-calving. They're getting their low potassium forage, keeps the weight off them, I suppose, too, because it's hay, and they're strip grazing, as you can see there in the background. So that's the idea. And look, that cow in front of you, I suppose, is close to really what we'd like for body condition at calving down. You know, plenty decent cover on her, but ribs still showing, and not too full across the tail head either. And that would be the general run of things. So it's quite low labor really, Stuart, that there's no bedding and no messing like that. The calves are very healthy when they calve out like that. And look, in the good conditions in September, and you've got a good block, you know, when you've got a high 6-week calving rate, you get a lot of cows calved in decent weather. Obviously, as the tail end comes in and weather changes, we do have to bring them, you know, they'll be brought in and calved indoors if the weather is poor. But that seems to work very well. We'll bring Aidan in now in a second. So look, at overall, 11 kilos dry matter intake roughly. They're getting their 8.5 units of energy, which is enough to gain a little bit of condition, but not too much. Their diet overall will be sort of 12% crude protein, which is fine for a dry cow. There'd be no real issues with colostrum quality. Or the mg there is magnesium. We're looking for sort of 0.4% mag, so that's 25 grams of supplemented magnesium for milk fever purposes, and try and keep the potassium as low as we can in the diet as well for sort of milk fever for milk fever reasons. So that's where the calf, that's our sort of standing haylage there, if you like. So they get a strip of that every day plus the haylage, or so that's your standing grass. For that puts a bit of protein and a bit of quality into the diet. The haylage dilutes out the minerals, and then they're getting their supplementary minerals as well. So it's quite sort of low tech, but seems to work fairly well. Any comments on that, Aidan, in terms of management of that, or what way are we? How's that working in general for dry cows?
Yeah, no, like you said, it's sort of no frills. It's really, once the weather stays with you, it's really easy. But like nearly every year we have that 70% or that 75% of the cows out on the Calving paddock, just as you outlined there. The other 20 or 25% then sort of towards the weather is sort of after breaking a bit, and they're generally calved indoors. What we are at the moment there this week now, we just we have still some grass left in the Calving paddock, so we're grazing, letting them out by day and just turn them into a house by night. We didn't really have that option up until this year. We have a sort of a better calving shed facility that we can sort of turn in a group of cows there now, but up until that it was very much out in the Calving paddock regardless of the weather. Sort of this year, then if the weather break a bit, we have the option just to turn them in for the night the way they want to turn up the paddock ratting. But worked really well. I think generally anybody will say the autumn cows, they tend to be fitter ratting, but they just fire out the calves a lot quicker. Now this year we went through, we had actually we had to assist 5 cows in a space of 10 days, and all calves coming backwards. We didn't know what way. We were blaming the AI man or something. I don't know.
Put them in backwards.
Straw the wrong way going into the gun.
But we wouldn't have had, but this just pure freak, like. But other than that, virtually no assists or anything like that. So.
In terms of observation, then, Aidan, is it are they close to hand to the unit that you can see them on an ongoing basis at that stage, or what is it?
Yeah, it's the paddock closest to the shed, and we are sort of, that's the one we use sort of nearly every year, and like on the road where we're driving up and down the whole time. And what we do then, like Joe would have said, the reason when we're feeding out the minerals, it's through a sort of about a kilo of a sort of just a coarse ration, just the minerals mixed in it in the evening, because there's no one here at night, right? And so generally I'll throw that out to them there sort of around 5 o'clock, before 5 o'clock, and you'll check them. Then you can sort of get a hand on the pins, right? And then if you think they're going to calve, somebody will probably come back to check them there at some stage during the night. And if there's nothing on, then they'll know when they'll be back. So it's a long time between 5 o'clock, like in a normal commercial farm, maybe someone will have a look at them before they go to bed, or anything like. But here it's sort of someone will come back, or if not, there's nothing happening, it's sort of next morning 7 o'clock then, or whatever. So yeah.
So just to make the point too, Stuart, it's important there that, like, as you can see from that paddock, it's not a bare paddock they're on.
Yeah, which would be an important point from the K point of view, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think sometimes
those fresh little regrowths are very high in K.
Yeah, exactly. So I think sometimes you do see it on a lot of farms, and where maybe they're out on a bare paddock and there's regrowths coming back, and that's very high KF stuff. So that can be a real problem. So it really is just kind of, that paddock is very heavy cover, as you can see. It's stripping through that, fencing them off the residuals basically, and keep making sure that it's a standing hay essentially, rather than a bare paddock. And that is important to sort of point out. I think calving outside can go very wrong if you're eating lush green grass. Like, you'd often see that for fellas in the spring, even, where they might be behind and they're turn out the later calvers, and it can be a bit of a nightmare. So it's not, it might, there's a lot of science behind what you're looking at in that picture. So believe it or not. So no, it is important just to make sure that, I wouldn't like people to sort of decide to put cows out, to calve them outside, and and run into a lot of problems. So
Yeah.
just to be clear on that. And look at, maybe just to highlight that, look at, this is our mineral composition, just in our silage. You can see on the left hand side here, not to go into too much detail, but the potassium in some of the stemmier stuff that we would have for the spring herd is at 2.2, 2.3% potassium. It would want to be that low anyway, even slightly high, that's on the borderline. But you look here on some of the stuff that was taken off surplus paddocks, or very, May surplus silage, if you like, in bales, that's up at 3% potassium. So like, if you fed that silage on the right to dry cows, you could be running into trouble with magnesium and milk fever. The one on the left hand side is relatively low risk, I suppose. So just to be clear, that the mineral content, particularly the potassium, would be important to keep an eye on. So left hand side, sort of, that's more like your sort of stemmy or 68 DMD silage, suitable for a dry cow. Stuff on the right, high digestibility, cut in May, very high in decay levels. Anything over 2.4%, you would have to begin to keep an eye on it. So just to be clear that point. And certainly, if you were grazing lush swards with dry cows, they're probably eating something like what's on the right. We wouldn't be suggesting that should be done at all. Okay, just that we're clear on that. Okay.
Yeah. So just before
okay.
you move on to the indoor feeding, Joe, the residuals on the paddock there that the cows are grazing at that stage, like, what? Obviously, where they're feeding the haylage is going to be maybe soiled a bit, so they're not going to clean it out. But do you make them skin it, or what way do you work it? Like, and we'll say, how do you actually put that cover there? Then that's, as you said, there's a bit of science behind it. Obviously, Aidan, you make a decision at some point in time that you have to stop that field in order to get it to where you want it to be for September, like, or probably from mid-August, really, is it?
Yeah, I know. Even earlier, like, it's probably from about it could be even oftentimes when we start drying off, Stuart. So when we leave it closed, like, so ideally sort of 6 or 8 weeks. The rougher the better, really, is the easiest way of sort of saying it now. Even actually, because what you were saying about I was laughing there about the residuals. You normally get a sort of a damp week or something where the residuals are, once we're in compliance and we're not doing any damage, we move the feeder regularly, and also it's just oftentimes it can be a bit brown, and we would shake some grass seed on it sort of around now on any of the brown areas. So actually, at the moment, the grass quality is probably nearly a bit too good, even if you leave it for a few weeks. There was some clover in one of the mixes that we shouldn't really probably use, really. Like, ideally, just sort of a stemmy hay is what we want. So we want to, like, if it's growing for 8 weeks, it's fine. We can afford to, we plan that out and just leave it. And then the residual, push them hard. Like, actually, we're feeding a sort of a hay this year. We didn't have any haylage, and then they like the hay. They're not even cleaning out as well as we'd like on the butt. But if you leave them hard enough, like, just leave nothing behind you. But like we were saying, you're back fencing then, so you're given a chance for recovery. It's amazing. The same as any marking that you'll do out in a grazing paddock. It's amazing once you take stock off it, how green the grass can recover quick enough as well. So yeah.
So, but just to remember, sure, they're not on that for the entirety of their dry period. Like, they are covered. So it's really only a couple of weeks, and they're rolling in and out of that paddock. So it's not like there's a whole 8 weeks per cow on that kind. They're really only on that for sort of 15 days, 20 days maybe on average per cow is all there would be. And look at, again, even on the heifers, like, your first calf heifers are a low milk fever risk anyway, so they're in there, but it's not, they don't have to be in there for as long maybe as even the mature cows would be. So that's just to point that out too. Look, we'll move on to the indoor feeding thing, just because we need to keep moving, I suppose. So look, I suppose the first thing we're going to say on the indoor feeding thing, of course, like, we have to say this, that really at this stage, the bullet is in the gun at this stage as far as the quality goes. It's really yeah. So what are we going to do? Like, silage quality is really obviously going to dictate what we do for the winter. And I do hear some lads saying sometimes, that you know, particularly maybe on particularly heavy farms or wet farms where there is a concern, and a legitimate concern, to have enough silage for the winter, never mind quality. You know, if you're going to be serious about winter milk, obviously you're going to need decent quality silage. And to be fair, and you can see that through the silage competitions at different parts of the country over the years, there are some people out there that are just experts at making silage. They make very, very good silage, and they seem to do it every single year. They have a recipe which involves reseeded swards, good soil fertility, and cutting at the right time, and they get what they need in the pit. And then it's the same people every year, and like there's no point in telling them what to do, because they know what to do already. It's the people in the middle maybe that just need to push silage quality that little bit. Now look, there is you know, the average silage quality obviously in the country is about 66, 67 DMD. On maybe winter milk farms it'd be slightly higher, but we would like to see it sort of certainly into the mid 70s, I suppose, which was really kind of your sort of mid-May cut with plenty of leaf in it. If there's stem or seed head in it, you're probably gone a little bit too late. So look, all the talk about balance and diets and all the rest of it, really the reality is that if you're talking about, you know, silage that's sort of less than 70, certainly DMD, or certainly less than anything less than 70, it becomes very, very difficult to do much with concentrates to balance that up. Because, you know, even if you look at it on paper, if you get the same level of sort of UFL and protein on paper, if the forage portion of the diet is higher, and a lot of that quality is coming from the forage, the diet will feed out better than a similar diet on paper that's made up of meal. It's just, remember, it's a rumen you're feeding, I suppose, and that's the reason why. So look, that's the first point. It's really silage testing is the thing, and looking at this stage, you're almost looking at it as a way of deciding, should I do a better job next year on my silage, or did I do a good job this year? And then you balance from there. Now look, this is pit silage from ourselves for this year. Look, it's at 73 DMD. We probably would like it maybe a couple of points higher than that, but protein percent for ourselves is about 14.5, which is decent enough. Dry matter's at 34%, so it is a dry silage. It's well preserved. You can see the pH is good, the ammonia is good. It's well preserved. The fiber levels aren't too high. And the PDIN and PDIE, which are the values of protein, basically, we look at that in a while, they're pretty good as well. So look, we'd like a couple of extra points maybe on digestibility, but I think based on the dry matters and the preservation of it, that silage we would expect to feed out relatively well, and it sets us off in a good place to start building the diet overall. Just one figure maybe to draw your attention to, Stuart, this feed into milk intake figure here, which is calculated as sort of the intake potential of the silage on low levels of supplement, so less than 2 kilos of supplement. For anyone looking, if they want to sort of give an idea, if you divide that figure roughly by 8, it'll give you what the silage intake will be for a sort of 600, 620 kilo cow. So in this case, dividing that by 8, we're talking about that the silage has an intake potential of somewhere around 14 kilos dry matter, which would be decent. A poorer quality silage with high fiber or poorly preserved might only have an intake value of 11 kilos dry matter. So straight away you're into 3 kilos more supplement to get to the same point. So on the analysis that's coming there through an accredited lab, it must be said as well that it's an accredited test. You're talking something around 6.97 kilos for a sort of a 27 litre feeding rate or thereabouts. So we'd be relatively happy. We'd probably like a little bit more in digestibility, but I think it'll feed out pretty decent. Aidan, just on that's on our first cut pit silage. Any comments in terms of, you know, when it was made, when it was closed, what it got? Not just in summary, like what was the basis of making that silage? That's your first cut pit stuff.
Yeah, our first cut pit stuff. It was cut. It was made the 14th of May. So I was disappointed. I seem to be disappointed every year. Like I think in that middle class that you were talking about, Joe. Like, cause we seem to consistently, our target is always 75. We seem to consistently hit sort of 73, 74, or maybe 75 a good year. You know that. We're cutting, our target every year is to cut sort of mid-May. If you have a target to cut the 20th of May and the weather is bad, it could end up rolling out towards the end of May. So our target sort of any time from 10th, 15th of May that's our target. If it rolls to the 20, it's not a disaster at neither, depending on the weather. Would have been closed for at least 6 weeks, I suppose, really. A good portion of it would have been grazed. We're not concerned because we need to take a second cut for nearly all of it again on the autumn system. We need good quality silage on both first and second cuts. We're not concerned about really the yield. If it's fit to cut, we'll cut it. And if there's only 4.5 ton on it, even in the first cut, we'll get 4.5 ton in the second cut. If you take a cut of 5 or 6 ton in the first cut, it'll be slower recovering, and you'll lose at the second cut. So not really concerned too much if it's
dry matter per hectare, Aidan, you're talking about.
Yeah. And it's quality we're chasing, and probably where we're falling down a bit, maybe there's a portion of what our outblock is in that pit as well, and some of it probably needs to be reseeded. It's sort of probably 10 years and cutting silage every year, so that might be bringing down that's what we'll make.
Points, yeah.
And then
it
wouldn't have been we'd be going on in late January, early February or whatever with the first application, so it'd be split applications, probably getting less than 100 kgs when in total anyway before first cut, depending on slurry and everything. So there'd be a mix there. It's just
So I'd say, look, in summary, Stuart, not to get onto the actual composition of the diet, I suppose the tweaking we probably need is a bit more detail on the outblock, which probably needs to be cut without being grazed in the spring. Cut that a few days earlier, and that would be it. But I still think that'll feed out. That'll still feed out relatively well. It's 73 DMD. It's dry, well preserved, good protein levels in it. It'll still do a job for us, and it's we're basically, if you want to look at the diet now, just how that'll fit into the diet, we'll be feeding 9 kilos dry. Sorry,
Joy, it's typical of the silage that we've made for the last 4 or 5 years, and like, in fairness, we're happy with the way it's sort of feeding out. Like, sure, you'll go through the diet that we've been using, so like maybe it'll feed out a little bit better even than a test. Like, we'll be testing it as we feed out during the year, and sometimes it will come up that like.
It will. I think it generally does feed well, and we're never that. The performance is relatively good or relatively on target. So look at Stuart. So this will be our sort of standard diet. Now look at the proportions of maize and silage and grass silage would vary depending on the system, but our general run of things over the last few years has been kind of 2/3 grass silage, 1/3 maize silage. So the maize silage would be over 30 for dry matter and for starch. So good quality maize silage brought into the diet, 9 kilos. So you're talking about 13.5 to 14 kilos of forage intake, which is important. Then they're getting 3 kilos of a high protein blend through the forage, which is basically a blend of barley, beet pulp, soya, and distillers. So a cereal, a pulp, soya, and then an intermediate or a secondary protein source plus minerals. They're getting 3 kilos of that, so that's your 9 and 4.5, and then your 3 kilos of blend is what is the sort of basic diet. They're all getting a couple of kilos in the parlour at least, and then depending on whether it's, say, low yielders or higher yielders, up to maybe 7 kilos in the parlour roughly. So your higher yielders could get, your higher yielding cows could be sort of sitting on around something in 3 kilos to something around 8 kilos, 8.5 kilos of ration in total plus the forage. That's roughly where we're at. So it's a high energy concentrate in the parlour as well, and that's obviously mineralized too. So you're covered for calcium, phosphorus, there's a bit of salt in there plus your trace minerals. So really what we're saying there is that if you take your forage plus your blend plus your basic kilo or kilo and a half of concentrate in the parlour, that's covering you for about something in the region of 20 kilos of milk, and then you sort of top up the higher yielders up to 30 kilos with the additional concentrate, which they'll eat easily. In terms of the total diet, what that looks like on paper, then total dry matter is about 36%, which is good level for getting good intakes. Our energy levels 0.95 for UFLs, and that's for the total diet, which would be pretty decent. Our crude protein levels are sort of 15.5 to 16, maybe closer to 15.5 generally. So we're not pushing for using very high crude protein ingredients. For the sake of it, we're really looking for high energy ingredients with a good protein profile. The PDIN and the PDIE there are two measures of protein. So the PDIN is basically the amount of protein that the cow absorbs, basically based on the amount of nitrogen in her diet, and the PDIE is the amount of protein she absorbs, which is based on the amount of energy in her diet. So basically what you've got there is nitrogen and energy working together, and they're quite closely balanced. They're quite closely balanced overall. So really what that's saying is we're not wasting crude protein and we're not wasting energy, really. And when we do them sums, generally speaking, we should be able to balance the diet at sort of 15.5 crude protein overall, rather than we used to be up at 17.5 and 18%, which was really kind of just wasting nitrogen and was reducing our nitrogen efficiency as well. So we're happy enough that that diet will perform pretty decent. Our solids percentages over last winter, they kind of did 348 protein as fresh cows, thereabouts, 420 fat, and something in and around the 31 kilos of milk. That's what that diet was returning, which we're relatively happy with. Starch and sugar, we'll just run through them and come to the questions in a second. Starch and sugar together, if you add those two together, if it's under 20%, there's not a huge risk of acidosis. So you can see there, you're in and around the 20% in combined starch and sugar, and we're happy enough that that's not a very risky diet or a very hot diet in terms of acidosis risk. And then our fiber, which we'll come to maybe in more detail in a second, we're looking at fiber in two ways, I suppose. The neutral detergent fiber, which is kind of really dictates your intake. That's kind of a measure of total fiber and including what's digestible in that. 35-36% is very, very safe. You could drop that down to 30% easily and for very high performing herds. But, you know, based on that level, and then the ADF then is really the more indigestible part of the fiber, if you like. It's once that's over 20%, you don't really have much issue with acidosis. So based on that, like there's no need for any additional fiber to be added. We're happy enough that if we're getting them intakes of forage, if we feed the concentrate as we feed it, there's some pulp in there as well. We're not worried at all about fiber fractions. And I think maybe Aidan might comment on that in terms of digestive upsets or issues like that. Feeding up to 7 kilos in the parlour plus 3 outside for the very higher yielding cows, we've had no real issue with acidosis or digestive problems once they're settled on that diet. Just any comment on that, Aidan, in terms of managing in the winter time? Are we happy enough that cows are eating that and not there's no real upsets in terms of digestive wise?
No, yeah, very happy. Yeah, it's just in terms of digestive upsets, we haven't had I don't think we had an LDA or a displaced abamazine either at both the autumn or the spring herd that's in kind of past and come across them nearly since the last 10 or 12 years. Really, like, to be very settled that way. The odd ketonic cow maybe, but it might be more something else really that's causing it, really sort of issues, sort of dirty after calving or something maybe, but very little. It just settled then, and then like I suppose maybe going back to when we were feeding the Trafford Gold, those sort of things were a trickier diet. Like, it's a very simple diet, and once the silage quality is good, I think it's like you were saying before, it's easy enough making up the refusals. Then, like, there's there's no bad silage going in, and there's no refusals, they're licking it clean. And just in terms of, I don't know whether it's definitely over the last few years, I suppose we pulled the protein back, and I think the cows are, maybe it's just the type of cows improved from an EBI that they're holding condition, but we're not pushing maybe our peak milk yield, like what you were saying earlier, isn't peaking quite as high, but they're holding a flatter yield, and they seem to be holding condition better even when we're breeding and all. So maybe it's more the cow than the diet. I'm not sure. Maybe you'd have a comment on that, Joe. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think, look, at where we're at with the protein there, Aidan, is really that we've taken the surplus or the excess protein out of the diet essentially, but we probably haven't dropped the protein so far that it would actually impact hugely on milk yield at all. So probably a little bit of saving in nitrogen efficiency. I think the cow, as you say, the breeding for fertility subindex and maintenance subindex, particularly the fertility subindex, makes it easier to keep condition on cows. And it's a thing I've come across many times over the years where people are breeding heavily for cows that are designed to lose weight, and then they're ringing looking for people to design diets for them to keep the weight on them. which doesn't make a lot of sense. It's very hard to make up a diet to keep condition on a cow
that doesn't drive milk.
That actually just wants to milk, genetically wants to milk off her back, essentially. So look at what that diet does, Stuart, is really turns us out that sort of 30 to 32 kilos of milk, depending on the silage quality and depending on the year, in and around that, in around 31 kilos on average. And then you're talking, the solids will stay, you keep the protein north of 345 in the fresh cows and keep the fat north of 410. We're happy enough for that part of the season. We can certainly make gains then when we get them to grass. But I think it's a relatively simple, relatively simple targets. Keep the energy up, don't overdo the protein. And the real challenge really for a lot of people, I think, and for ourselves included, is to get the fiber fraction down in the diet rather than trying to put the fiber up, because it's to try and get the cows to eat a little bit more is the problem. And that NDF fiber figure is something that really does dictate, intake. So look, we would work on the basis that sort of 230 times the peak would roughly be what we'll produce for the year. So like if we get the cows to sort of the 32 litre mark, they'll probably end up doing 7,500 or thereabouts for the year. And I think, given where we're at in the type of system we're running, I think we're relatively happy that that's an efficient diet to run with. So look, it does make it easier, and it's back to that point, and we'll come to maybe in a second. It does make it easier that if you look at our calving pattern, like the stale springs cows, or those cows are well done and they're well finished in terms of their milk yield by the time you get into early mid-December. So really, that when you sort of get to the 10th of December, it's really the spring herd is essentially finished, and what you're doing then is concentrating on feeding the fresh calvers very, very well through Christmas and on into the new year. Do you get me? It's not like we're trying to,
you're doing your blocks of work all the time.
Yeah, you're not doing your stragglers. I think sometimes is the big problem on a lot of herds, where you have this cow that calves in May and June, and she's going into the shed doing 18 or 20 litres and still good milk yield, but does she end up getting fed for 30 kilos then, and maybe getting over conditioned, or maybe just inefficient use of feed? So it is important that it's nice to be able to say, right, here's my fresh calvers. They're after doing they're in a while now, and we sort of set them up and try and feed them as well as we can. And we're not the thing isn't complicated by having sort of rollover cows or stragglers that are inefficient in terms of their ability to produce milk at that time of the year. So look,
there's just two questions here. So Joe, the protein content of the blend. What's that work?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, look, that will work out at about 23%, right? That'll work out 23% protein overall, and then 18 on the other one. But it's 23% protein based on good ingredients. It's not made up of high protein byproducts with low energy. It'd be decent. So it's basically more or less what it is. It's a quarter. It's pretty much, if you want to look at it, it's a four-way mix or close to it of the four ingredients with the minerals included as well. Thereabouts.
We would adjust that, Joe, depending if quality wasn't as good, maybe. Or depending on what way. So that when we know the maize, the analysis of the maize and the silage, we can adjust.
Essentially,
It's only tweaking that way, it really is, isn't it?
That's it. So we tweak there maybe more so than on the protein. Essentially, we can up or down the soy and distillers relative to the barley and beet pulp, and that'll change our protein fraction in the diet overall. But it's if you've set that up in that way, it's a good diet. If you said that you're foraging that blend plus a kilo or so in the parlour for your lower yielder cows, that's a good diet for them. If you feed that diet plus 6 kilos in the parlour, it's still a relatively well balanced diet for the higher yielding cows, because the 18 protein nut is just giving you a little bit of an extra quality for the higher yielding cows. So that's where we're at, Stuart. That's where we're at on that. And look, I fully take the point.
Before you move on again, then, so Joe, like if you didn't have the maize silage now, and Aidan's obviously kind of alluded to it there a small bit, that you tweak it, what would you be changing in terms of the blend? Obviously, you're more grass silage going in then instead of your maize, but you kind of compromised a small bit in terms of energy, maybe that the maize bring a little bit more energy into it for you if you didn't have maize.
Yeah, I think the big challenge without the maize is the intake, Stuart, is to get the
fill value is just too high with the silage.
Yeah, just whenever you mix two forages, you're going to get an additional. Just going to get extra. You're going to get extra intake. Now, look at if you were feeding 68 DMD silage and you put maize in, it would transform the diet. But if you were feeding 75 DMD silage and you put the maize in, it would improve it slightly, but not dramatically. So I think. Sorry.
Joe, I think, well, it's an interesting question, but we probably don't have time now. But like we have a treatment here in Johnstown that is only getting grass silage and 8 kilos of an 18% nut. I was running last year alongside what the you've had, and where we were losing out there really was probably in the milk. We're back probably about 0.15 in protein, back maybe Joe, a litre and a half. But like, provided the silage quality was still very good, so I suppose the huge key then is you really have to have rock and fuel silage quality and a good nut, and then you will milk away. The cows will be fine, but you will lose a little bit, I suppose, Joe.
You will, and you probably end up putting in a bit more maybe a bit more maize grain in the mix as well, just to get a bit more starch, a higher energy starch source in as well, Aidan, that you'd into your blend. But you will. It's very difficult to make up that difference. Sure, you'll probably lose certainly 0.1 on the protein probably anyway, and a bit on the milk. But look at the thing is, and in that case too, like for a lot of fellas maybe listening to this, they're not block autumn calving either, right? So it might only be 20% or 25% of the herd that's freshly calved in the autumn, right?
Yeah.
So then you're talking about 25% of the herd milking for 100 days or for 120, 130 days inside. It becomes a relatively small proportion of the annual milk yield as well. You have to remember that too, like what percentage of milk, for anyone that's in a split calving system and maybe only has a relatively small number of autumn calvers, what percentage of autumn calvers have they got? Like, will you see if there was 0.1 of a difference for a month or two? Would you see it in the annual figures? That's a question that needs to be asked as well. But essentially, if you're talking about making up the diet, in summary, to make up the diet differences is really have to push for very, very high quality grass silage, probably include a bit more maize grain in the blends for higher energy, and that's basically all you can do to make up the difference. So, the maize silage certainly makes a difference when your silage quality is moderate. It makes less of a difference when the silage quality is excellent, I think.
Okay. And just one final question then on the maize, I suppose, whole crop versus maize. Have you any thoughts which is better, or have you looked at it?
We would, certainly John Murphy years ago in Moore Park would have done work on that, and it was very similar work done in a lot of studies in the UK as well. The best maize outperformed the whole crop, but the variability in the maize crop was always the issue. Like, that maybe whole crop was more of a steady thing, and that for some farms it was something that was maybe more predictable or maybe more consistent over years, depending on the site that you were on. But certainly the high quality maize give probably the highest increase in total intake and best in performance. Now look at, yourself, Stuart, that the problem with a lot of whole crop is that it doesn't set out as whole crop in the start of the year. It's in some cases a lot of whole crop made is in whole crop in name only. Like it could be a salvage job, or it could be something, anything with a bit of stuff in it. It all seems to pass as whole crop at this stage. But a proper winter crop that's set out, that's designed specifically to make a good crop of whole crop from the start, it can come close to the maize, I suppose, but it probably depends on the site. The maize is probably preferable, but it doesn't work in all parts of the country. That would be the main difference between them, I think, but again, don't dilute the message on grass silage based on the alternatives, I would say. Look, we just moving on because I think we're getting close on time. Yeah, just one thing just to make a point on it. It's back to that question on fiber. It is a very good measure. So look at your fiber content in your diet and see is it if it's over 35%, you shouldn't be worried about adding additional fiber. Lower fiber will actually reduce. It'll dry. Lower fiber will actually help the cows to eat more because they're limited by what fiber they can eat. So if you can get the fiber levels to manageable, it'll help them to eat more. The things we would be looking at to make sure we're managing the acidosis risk would be, we're balancing our starch fraction. So we're not putting in all wheat, for example. It's kind of putting in maize and barley, which are more slowly digestible, which is a good thing. We're putting in fiber sources like beet pulp or hulls, which are very high, are good for energy, but are more slowly digested. Obviously, feed space per cow, and feed space per cow is very, very important as well. The cows are not, physically that they're happy in their surroundings, so there's not bullying going on. This is something that I would just include because it's something you see when you go around a lot of places where you've got sort of moderate quality silage in the feed passage, and then you've got big lumps of straw sticking out of it, and you're basically saying that in a lot of cases there's already too much fiber in the diet, and then people are adding in straw into it, which is generally might be unnecessary. You're probably adding in fiber when it's taking fiber out. You need to be doing so. Just watch that. And one final point on that maybe is just chop length, which comes up from time to time as an issue. You obviously need a bit of chop length there in order to get your in order to stimulate cudding and for the cows to chew their cud. But how much long fiber is actually needed depend on the dry matter, the silage. But if you take your sort of 22 to 30% dry matter silage as a standard, really what you're talking about is kind of the chop length of the silage should be sort of like the bottle cap there. That's the length you're talking about, is the average chop length is the width of that bottle cap, and you don't want any more than about 10% of your particles over sort of 60 millimeters or thereabouts. So if you take your standard ear tag, the width of an ear tag is 55 millimeters. If you're adding in fiber and it's longer than the width of that tag, the cows are probably going to sort it out. They're probably going to leave it behind them, or they're going to pick through it. So if you want to add fiber into a diet that needs it, it would want to be sort of chopped to, you would want to be getting it down to sort of that 55 millimeters anyway, in order for the cows to not be sorting through it and picking through it. Because you often see that, like if you feed a stemmy bale or something, the cows leave the thistles and they leave the thistles and the docks behind them, like, so they can do that if it's too long. So there's no point in adding in fiber to increase the NDF content if the cows are just going to sort through it. It'll end up being left for the most timid cows in the herd. So the bully cows will eat all the good stuff. So don't be thinking that you need stuff that's as long as your arm in order to get the effect of fiber. You're really talking about getting stuff that's about the length of that tag or less, really. Okay.
Yeah.
We might. Are we out of time, Stuart?
Okay. Yeah, I'd say we're beginning. We want to have you much more to
no, there's only just one other final point here.
Yeah.
Just one thing, and something we've talked about before. Look at, and we might just call it on this. This is just this is actually just a milk yield. It's a milk recording from a herd doing a kind of an 8,000 kilo herd done in sort of a January recording or thereabouts, right? And what you're looking at here is the average of the herd at the time was about 28 kilos of milk or thereabouts. That's what they were averaging at the time. So they would have they did a few stales and mostly fresh cows milking, right? And that's what the red dot there is about, the sort of the average. So, but you can see obviously half the cows, 50% of the cows are below average and 50% of the cows are above average. Now look at, all I want to just make the point there, in that typical situation, which is very similar for a lot of herds, if you take 35 kilos and over, and we're taking that as indicative of high yielding cows, about 10% of the cows in the herd are over that level. And if you go over the 40 kilo mark, you're probably talking 5% of the herd or less are doing over the 40 kilos, right? So look at, all I just make the point is that there's a lot of milk being produced by cows that are down at this level here, sort of in the low to mid 20s or whatever. Don't allow the very high yielders that everybody talks about so much, don't allow them to dictate the diet for every other cow in the herd. So you want to be feeding sort of towards a realistic milk yield. We would be saying there, feeding close to the average of the 28, and maybe if you have to top up a few individual cows, then do so. Just to put that in context, I suppose, that very high milk from them very highest yielding cows is worth something between 1% and 2% of the daily milk yield in the herd. Most of the milk actually is sold from cows doing from 35 and under. So just to put that in context, what we want to do is, when we're setting out to set up a diet, we have to make sure that we get efficient production from the middle yielders and the low yielder as well, rather than just all the time talking about how do we fix the problem of the very highest yielding cows in the herd. Get the good base in, and then sort out them few individuals with a bit of extra parlour concentrate if needed. That's the message on that. Okay,
Very
we
good.
might leave it there, Stuart, because we're probably busted for time.
Yeah, we're just one good question though, Tim, or Joe, sorry, from Tim Lyons. What happens when the cows go back to grass in spring? Do you kind of wean them off the winter diet? So do you phase them back into the grass?
Very good question, yeah. Ed, do you want to take that maybe?
Yeah, so
yeah.
just, we're turning out to grass, sort of, we're adjusting, we're pulling back. Generally, we won't let them out unless they're getting at least 4 to 5 kilos of grass. It just wouldn't be worthwhile. What we've done if we were very tight in grass, oftentimes we go out and graze for 3, 4, 5 days with good weather and then bring it back in, because they're on such a good diet indoors. It doesn't unsettle the cows. They're happy to go out and they're happy to stay in either. But we'll adjust their diet. So if they're going out tomorrow, we know the weather's good to go out tomorrow, we'll adjust their diet down to probably about 80%. So rather than if you're feeding for 100 cows and you still have 100 cows, you just feed for 80 cows. So you keep the proportions right. Just drop, and generally the concentrate is the last thing will drop out anyway, really. So if they're on 8 kilos concentrate, it's be on 8 kilos concentrate. We drop the forages, and then we'll get very good clean out, and they're back in then. And then just as the more grass comes available, we keep dropping down the diet. But generally with that high stocking rate, we're nearly feeding right through most of the first round by night maybe, and if we're getting out by day, it's as good as we can do, but that's just from grass availability.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah.
There's just one other question there. The graph demonstrating the milk herd variation is excellent. It drives the message home. That's actually just a comment, I suppose, Joe. So I'm glad I actually left you short, because I'd said it to you earlier in the week about showing that not to be feeding the herd for 40 litres and the average is only 28 or whatever.
Yeah, and like a lot of the time, them cows, Stuart, as a final comment, a lot of them highest yielding cows, we've measured intakes, and certainly the lads in Moore Park have measured intakes on individual cows through the boxes and that over the years, and some of those individual cows on TMR systems could be eating 26, 27 kilos of dry matter. So they're looking after themselves in terms of their intake capacity. So I while get the base diet good, and don't allow them ones to drag you up, because that's what happens. You end up feeding 2 kilos extra to everything to sort out those 2 or 3% in the herd.
Yeah, very good. So I suppose long and short of it is whether it's autumn calving or spring calving, silage quality is important across all stock, and having the plan in place for it. And I think that's probably what comes across there. Aidan has a plan on how he's going to do everything there, whether dealing with the autumn herd or the spring herd. Maybe it sounds like maybe they're a lesser category on the farm, but that's not the case. It's just we weren't focusing on today. So silage quality and trying to keep that NDF down to keep up intakes is going to be important across all classes of stock, really, isn't it?
That's it.
Yeah, so that's excellent. Thanks a million, Aidan. Great to talk to you. And we'll probably talk to you again in December, just in the run into your start of your breeding season again, just to get a rundown on how you're preparing and what you're doing, maybe just for the winter milk herds that are out there. So thanks a million for coming on this morning, and thanks, Joe, as always. We'll see you again next week, folks.